tanks. Herman has on his staff and among his scholars luminaries ranging from Donald Rumsfeld, who's the former U.S. Secretary of Defense and held other leading positions in numerous governments, numerous presidential cabinets over the years, as well as Newt Gingrich, who is a former Speaker of the House of Representatives and a candidate for the presidency of the United States. Herman has traveled the world. He's an expert on foreign policy ranging from the old Soviet Union and Russia today to China to the Middle East. And he is an individual that literally on a regular basis, he and his colleagues at the Council look at the hot spots around the world and analyze them for foreign policy purposes, for stability, and for the impact on the U.S. and the global economy. They have produced a number of wonderful scholarly papers on differing subjects of foreign policy. And if you're a reader of the Washington Post, the New York Times, or some of the top newspapers around the world, you've seen articles by Herman or his fellow scholars at the American Foreign Policy Council in those newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, a man who's going to give us a snapshot on what's happening in the world today as it relates to foreign policy now and into the future and its impact on the U.S. economy. Would you please join me in welcoming my good friend, Herman Pirchner.
Thank you. First, I'm going to make sure my tech person gives me the wave that the lavalier is working. Okay, I guess we're all right. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to my only regret on this visit is I didn't get here in time to hear one of your great presentations. Those of you who are students here that get to sit through Tim's lectures really have a treat. I heard him speak first time a few years ago in Palm Beach, and I said, yeah, this is how it should be done. So you're fortunate. Before dinner, I walked around the campus a little bit. I'm from northeastern Ohio, about 30 miles east of Cleveland. And one of the things that struck me, to my amazement, was how much I appreciated the smell of the spring. You know, if you grow up in an area, you think everything smells the same and the rest of the world is the same. But different places in the world have uniquely different smells. And for me, it brought back some good memories, but it also brought to mind the thought that normal for us when we grow up is what we're surrounded with, because it's everything the only thing we know. And as we begin to travel, we find out that people live in different ways, think in different ways, and have different challenges. But it's possible for countries as well as people to be a little bit sheltered in thinking that their normal is everybody else's normal. And that can be good and bad. I think for those who have grown up in the United States, if you're yet less than 70, we've led in many ways not a very normal existence by world standards. And what do I mean by that? In the years since the 1950s, nothing really horrible by world standards has happened to us in the United States. What's horrible? Horrible is World War II. 2.5% of the entire world was killed, 2.5%. What's horrible? After World War I, you had famine in places that we think of as civilized today, Austria, Belgium. Not enough food, people died. What's horrible? 20 million dying during communism under the Soviet system, 80 million under Mao's China. From those experiences, nobody in society emerges unscathed. We're talking today about trouble spots that we all hope will never evolve into crises that affect Americans on so broad a scale as some of the tragedies I've just mentioned. And I suspect they will not. But on the other hand, if you read history, you know most generations have seen things that are quite unpleasant, and it behooves us to understand where these troubles can come from So if they begin to occur, we can react, we can influence politics, or maybe something as simple as buy and sell stock or otherwise protect your family. I'm going to start today with talking about the unfolding crisis in Ukraine. To understand what's going on, you have to understand the history. Vladimir Putin has said Ukraine is not a real state. Historically not true. The Ukrainian state has its roots back as far as the 9th century. And for a period of a few hundred years, it was the largest country in Europe. It was then overrun by the Mongol Empire, more than 100 years. This was followed by occupation by the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. And then in 1795, when Poland was invaded by Russia from its east and Germany from the west and Austria a bit from the south, Poland disappeared, and so did Hungary, and so did Ukraine, and not Hungary, Ukraine. And from that time until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the territory of Ukraine was largely ruled from Moscow. But that rule was not a very pleasant rule. During the Tsarist period, which was before 1917, before communism, the Tsars said to the Ukrainians, you can't speak your language in public places and in public business. You can't be taught in the Ukrainian language. You can't publish in the Ukrainian language. And if you happen to belong to the Unate Church, which is an Orthodox church that was pro-Rome, well, you can't do that anymore. We're going to fold it into the Orthodox Church. In other words, there was a systematic effort to repress Ukrainian culture. Now, this was more severe or less severe as different czars came and went. But it became far more serious with the advent of communism. In the 1930s, under Stalin, a huge effort was made to repress Ukrainian nationalism. They instituted, they being the communists, something called the Holodomor. It's essentially a forced famine. They picked Ukrainian villages, Ukrainian towns that were almost all anti-communist. They surrounded them with Bolshevik forces. They took the food out, and they didn't let anybody come in or go out. 2 million people starved to death. 2 million people. If you go to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, today there's a memorial to this mass starvation, and the Ukrainian state has been in the process of collecting the names of all those that were killed. They'll never make it completely, but already the list is kind of staggering when you think each of those names represent a human life. Also in the 1930s, you had the Gulag System, which many of you have heard about. This was a slave labor system. So the cream of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, the natural political leaders that were not getting in line with the communist system, they were taken from their homes, and if not shot, they were sent to slave labor camps, many, many time zones, sometimes 8, 9 time zones away from Ukraine, and put in horrible conditions and essentially worked to death. So you can understand that today's Ukrainian leaders, having had their parents or grandparents going through this experience, are not huge fans of Moscow. So for historical reasons, the Ukrainian state is fighting against advances from Moscow. But it's not purely a question of history, it's a question of the future, too. If you're under 30 in Ukraine, especially under 30, you look at Poland, the next door neighbor. Poland, at the time of independence of Ukraine, 1991, the time that Poland broke loose of Moscow's domination in the Warsaw Pact, Poles and Ukrainians lived exactly the same. Today, Poles who made economic reform live 3 times better. So for young Ukrainians, and I use that as Ukrainian citizens, not ethnic Ukrainians. If you're young, even if your first language is Russian, you say, how do I want to live? Do I want to live under rule of law? Do I want to live where I can at least have a chance to protect the fruits of my intellectual labor and my business efforts? Do I want to be able to have a higher standard of living, or do I want to live like Russia is? Now, things are still rough in Ukraine. They've made a lot of mistakes. The current leadership is at least trying to reform, so young people disproportionately have decided to try to create an independent, democratic, and free market Ukraine. But things look very different if you are in Moscow. When empires collapse, it usually causes a reaction. In the year 1900, there were only 55 sovereign countries in the world. Now there are 190 some, depending on how you count. Where did all these new countries come from? They came from the collapse of the 13 empires that dominated the world of 1900. And every single one of those empires had something in common when they collapsed. They all tried to reestablish their power in their former territories. Mostly it was for economic reasons, mostly it was done peacefully. But France, for instance, used armed forces 37 times at least in Africa to protect the economic interest. And so in a sense, nobody should have been surprised when Russia's state, which is ruled now through fear and selective assassinations, when Russia started to use force against Ukraine. And by the way, this current use of force has not been something that's triggered by an event in Maidan or anything that happened recently. This merely provided the opportunity, not the motivation. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, shortly after that you had a speech by the great anti-communist Alexander Solzhenitsyn before the Russian Duma, which then was a real legislature. And Solzhenitsyn talked about the need for a greater Slavic state. By that, he meant the countries of Belarus, have to figure out how to use this. There's Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and the northern part of Kazakhstan, which is not on this map. Shortly after that, there was a great work by a man by the name of Dmitry Rogozin. Rogozin might be nationalist number one in Russia today. He's deputy prime minister. But he said, it doesn't matter how long it takes. We have to unite the Slavic people coming out like Germany did after 40 years united in the end. We have to persevere in that. The problem is, for reasons I just said, it's an unrequited love. Russians may feel they want to put the union back together, like somebody in a failed marriage wants to put it back together when the partner doesn't want to do so. Ukraine doesn't want to do so, and this began to set up the fight. Russia began to lay concrete plans already 10 years ago. In the year 2001, the Russian Duma passed a law on the expansion of the territory of the Russian Federation. And that law was the one that was used to annex Crimea, which is here. Shortly after that law was passed, the Russian Ministry of Defense promulgated a doctrine that said the Russian military has the right to protect Russian nationals in a third country. The equivalent of somebody in Mexico saying, well, we can invade Arizona to protect Hispanics. But that is the Russian doctrine, and there was a doctrine used to justify the use of Russian forces in Crimea and in the eastern part of Ukraine. Now, I'm not sure how much many of you are following it, but Putin has essentially used a doctrine, tactical doctrine that was put forth by the Nazis in Czechoslovakia in 1938. There was a German minority in the Czech state in 1938. Hitler had just come to power, and he set about expanding the territory of the German state. And he started saying, well, the Germans aren't being treated properly by the Czech government, and we have to protect them. And at the same time, he was sending money in to the Germans there to make demonstrations and to protest against Czech rule. And he kept upping the demands, and finally went in with his military. And this is, with some variations, what Putin has done in eastern Ukraine. He's, over a period of years, spent money hiring mafia types, hiring legitimate Russian nationalists, hiring people that simply were broke and needed some money to make pro-Russian demonstrations, to join when the fighting began, the pro-Russian militias. But there should be no mistake that the fighting that now goes on in Ukraine is directed, funded, and equipped by the Russian government. Currently, they occupy this part of Ukraine. It's a sliver. It's about 3% of the landmass. But the problem is that these highly equipped and with modern Russian tanks, modern Russian electronic warfare, these troops are now poised to try to attack this city, and under some plans maybe even sweep all the way across Ukraine. Nobody knows if that's going to happen. But I was 5 weeks ago in Ukraine, and I can tell you the Ukrainian government takes the threats rather seriously. But in spite of Russia's overwhelming military power, there's some problems Russia has. And I'm going to talk to you now problems as they look from the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. From the Russian side, Putin has to lie to his own people about what he's doing. There have been thousands of casualties of Russian soldiers, and the Russian population hasn't been told that they're fighting, much less dying. Soldiers are coming back. They're being buried in unmarked graves. The mothers are simply told your son died in training. Soldiers are being sent to the front not knowing they're going into Ukraine or fighting. And this is all covered by a huge web of Russian propaganda to its own people that denies any of this has happened. They say only they're separatists that want to be with Russia in eastern Ukraine, and we're trying to help them. Not that Russians are themselves fighting and dying. This has spurned a movement of Russian mothers of Russian soldiers. They have been protesting. They have a movement that's growing, and this is a political problem for Putin. It's also a problem for Putin that the Russian economy is now suffering because of the sanctions the Western countries have put on them, suffering because the oil prices have gone down, and the Russian state is being crowded. Why is this a problem for Putin? It's not that he has to worry about what the average Russian thinks. He has to worry about what the KGB people around him that are also very wealthy think, because that's his real power base. It's a few hundred, maybe at most a few thousand people that hold the levers of power in Russia, almost all with an intelligence background. Now, Putin is able to stay in power because he takes care of their needs. He helps them steal huge amounts of money. He helps them get their money abroad. He referees among their disputes. But what happens when they can't visit their grand homes in Western Europe? What happens when they're not sure how their businesses will do and how their economic future will be? Putin becomes less useful. And he understands that when, in his society, when you become not useful, you can become dead. And he feels already this pressure. It's especially noted through recent comments by a man by the name of Yevgeny Primakov. Primakov was the head of the KGB. He was that's the Russian secret police. It has a very bloody past. He was prime minister of Russia, and probably would have been president of Russia instead of Putin if it weren't for the fact that his given name is Finkelstein, and internal politics in Russia are such that somebody that's Jewish could never become president. They may take a Russian name, as Primakov did, and they may prosper and do everything else, but the top job, probably not. What did Primakov say? Primakov said, Putin did very well to take Crimea, but, Russia can't stand to be isolated in the world, and we should settle what's going on in the eastern part of Ukraine, and then take things more slowly. Now, that Primakov said this in a society where nobody questions number one, which is Putin, can only mean one thing, that a significant part of the KGB establishment, that is Putin's power base, is now having second thoughts, and they picked Primakov, well into his 80s, as the man to say it because he's relatively invulnerable. He could say it because of age and past position. So Putin is being pushed, and he tries to lessen this pressure by recruiting very tough guys from Muslim Chechnya to fight, from taking people out of jail. He goes to people in jail and says, well, you can sit in jail or we can pay you to go kill Ukrainians. Well, a lot of people think getting paid and being in Ukraine is better than jail, so he has people like that that are fighting. How do we know that? Because in war, people are taken prisoners, and when they're prisoners, they're interrogated and they tell their story. We know because we have intercepts of conversations. Some of the things that are done by NSA and virtually all other advanced security sources in the world means if you're talking, somebody's listening to you, and so it's very hard to keep secrets. So this is what it's looking like from the Russian side. Putin has this dream, a nationalist dream, of making Russia bigger, not just with Ukraine, but with other places. I'll talk more about that later. On the Ukrainian side, they don't want to be invaded, and they don't want to live under Putin's rule. And who's fighting there? Putin had made a grand stroke in the year 2010 when a pro-Russian, essentially ex-mafia thug, for lack of a better word, by the name of Yanukovych was elected president of Ukraine. And he proceeded to strip the state. When he fell from power after the demonstrations in Maidan two years ago, the treasury was empty. The army had essentially been stripped of any effectiveness. Equipment had been sold. People had been promoted that might be pro-Russian or were just thieves. And Putin's initial plan was that Yanukovych would sign an agreement that would unify the economies, and this would lead gradually to absorption by Russia. But seeing what would happen, there was a great explosion among the Ukrainian people. They went into the main square of Kiev, the capital, and they demonstrated days on end, and they didn't leave even when snipers began shooting the number, over 100 dead. People just at the top of buildings shooting into the crowd randomly, trying to break the demonstration in opposition to the pro-Russian president. It was bloody. People around Putin were pushing for more people to be killed. Surkov, a very close Putin aide in particular, made public statements that you need to kill more people to get control. Well, that wasn't forgotten. And as Yanukovych finally fell from power and fled, he's in exile in Russia. But who was then, with the Ukrainian army, who was going to fight to stop the Russian-backed advance? And the answer was some army units were reliable, but militias sprang up. Rich people would put up money so they could take old weapons out of storage that had been there since World War II and could refit these weapons. They were old, but they still worked. Young people would have to raise $800 to $1,000 to join a militia. Now, this is a country where you retire if you're poor and old at $200 or $300 a month. Raise $1,000 is a lot of money, but they went out and they would raise it. For they got a uniform, a gun, and some of the money went for refitting of the old weaponry. And they were sent to the front against trained people for the most part, and they were chewed up. There's no training. They went out with a day's training, at most they had 3 weeks training. But they went and they continue to go today. And time begins to work for this reason a bit for the Ukrainians, because as time goes on, they have more to fight, they have better training, but to this date, still no weaponry to meet advanced Soviet tanks or Russian tanks. Russian tanks have advanced armor, and it takes equipment that would be produced, for instance, in the United States to pierce that armor and to stop any attack. The U.S. Congress has voted on a bipartisan basis in both houses to provide that weaponry, but so far the Obama administration has chosen not to do so, though it is continually under consideration. Well, where is this going to go? If Putin comes in and begins to take more territory, which is possible but not inevitable even in the next few weeks, there will be a guerrilla movement. That means in occupied territories, there will be Ukrainians that will fight at night and look like civilians during the day. They will blow up buildings. They will commit selective assassinations, all to raise the cost of an occupation by Russia. They will also hope that sabotage will occur in Russia proper. And this is one of the reasons that Russia holds back from going in. They may go in, but there are alternatives being advocated by nationalists in Russia. And one of these alternatives is extremely dangerous, and I want everybody to focus on it. There are people that are nationalists inside of Russia that think Russia should go into Latvia. Latvia is part of the former Soviet Union. It's now a member of NATO. There are only 2 million people in Latvia. In other words, if Russia went in, there's nobody to fight. But what happens if a NATO member is invaded and we have an obligation to come to their defense? Do we simply not meet our treaty obligation? If we don't do that, then NATO collapses, and it means Russian dominance of Europe, because if Europe understands the U.S. will not stand behind our commitments to NATO, then they will accommodate to a ruthless Russia. And do we start a fight, which is alternative, with a state that's a nuclear power? These are unattractive options, but it's something that may be pushed by reckless people around Putin, because they somehow think the West has no stomach to react. And what is their evidence for that? The evidence has to do with red lines that were drawn in Syria and nothing happened. It has to do with something called the Budapest Accord. The Budapest Accord was signed in 1994. Ukraine was a nuclear state at that time. Under the Budapest Accord, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for territorial guarantees by Russia, which signed the paper, the U.S., which signed the paper, and the United Kingdom. So the saying goes, if the U.S. isn't going to stand behind a guarantee like that, where they don't have to pay a big price, we're not talking about the U.S. fighting, we're talking in Ukraine, we're talking only about arming Ukraine so they can fight themselves. The U.S. won't stand behind that. Will they really stand behind a guarantee for Latvia? It's a big question, and it's a question that's being asked by everybody in the world, if it's a non-state actor like a terrorist movement, or if it's countries that wish the U.S. ill. They say, well, if the U.S. won't meet its guarantees to Ukraine, if the U.S. will not stand behind a red line it drew in Syria, doesn't matter if it was right or wrong to draw it, it was drawn, maybe it's now's the time we should move against U.S. interests. So what's our inaction, what's the appetite of those that would wish the U.S. ill? And this is why it's such a dangerous situation. It could spread to other countries, and it could involve the U.S. and Western Europe in general fighting. It could spurn terror attacks or other people to move against U.S. interests. And I'm going to talk about other trouble spots, but I think maybe I'll stop now in case anybody wants to talk about Ukraine a little more. We can take some questions, and after questions we can move on. Yes? Yes. Yeah. Putin's intentions are not so clear, but the intentions of people around him, such as Dmitry Rogozin, who I quoted, are quite clear and have been spelled out over a long period of time. But Putin has given hints to his intentions. He said the collapse of the Soviet Union, meaning the independence of Ukraine and other countries that are now independent, was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. not the Second World War, not Nazism, not World War I, but the collapse of the Soviet Union. He said these other countries, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, they're not really countries. So his contempt for the independence of others, his contempt for agreements that have been made, not just the Budapest Accord, but the two ceasefires that he agreed to and violated is quite clear. So Putin is not believed by anybody in Western Europe. Nobody will trust him at all. Too many guarantees, including private ones to heads of state, that were broken. Yeah. Speak a little louder for me. Yeah. If someone is an aggressor and they attack and they're successful in taking territory and nothing is done, it makes them more aggressive usually. The Russian saying is eating increases the appetite. Think of a tough guy in a neighborhood and he starts bullying people and nobody stops him. Does he stop bullying just because he got his way with the first person? Probably goes to the next and the next. And it's the same way in international relations. People that are aggressors and are not stopped tend to be more aggressive, and that's the danger. Oh, yeah, we should back Ukraine, I'm sorry. No. Definitely not with Reagan. With Bush it's less clear, but definitely not with Reagan. But he wouldn't have given up his aspirations. He simply would have waited for a more opportune time. Here's probably what, no way to know for sure, but here's probably what a Reagan administration would have done. They would have sent a secret embassy ambassador to Moscow to talk to Putin, and they would have said, look it, we both signed the Budapest Accord. That means the territory of Ukraine is not to be violated. If you do that, we're not going to fight you, but you're going to see an extremely well-armed Ukraine and a very long guerrilla war. And by the way, we're going to do everything we can to sink your economy and make trouble for you in the world short of war. And Reagan, having credibility, probably would have been able to deter. Remember, it's when countries decide to act against someone's interests, they decide, is the U.S. going to fight? And is this president going to fight? Do they think it's worth fighting for? And if you have the sense that you'll fight over that, then it's deterrent. And Reagan had that reputation. Now, there may be other areas where Obama would be more believed, but with Russia, his track record hadn't been too good, so they gambled he wouldn't arm Ukraine, and they grabbed it. I think it probably was a mistake. It was denied first that it came from their troops, but the missile that shot down the airliner was almost certainly Russian provided. And if you want a good indication of the type of people that are running the occupied territories of Ukraine, you take a look at how you handle the bodies. The bodies were looted, and international observers were not permitted to come in to recover the bodies in a timely fashion. These people operate by very different rules than we do. Yes, in the back. The question is, wasn't there a part of Ukraine that actually wanted to join Russia? two answers for that. At the time of independence in 1991, every single Ukrainian province, and you can see the borderline there, voted to be independent, including the most Russian of them all, Crimea, which voted 52% to join an independent Ukraine. Now there was, after Russian troops came into Crimea, and it was denied, by the way, there weren't any Russian troops there, but recently Putin has made public statements bragging how clever he was to infiltrate these people in, and that they were indeed Russian special forces. When they did come in, they decided they were going to hold a special election of the Ukrainian, a session of the Ukrainian parliament. And what they did is they grabbed anybody that was remotely pro-Russian that belonged to the Crimean parliament. It would be like a state legislature, and they put them into the legislative chambers. It was quite a good story. But they wouldn't let them take a phone in, they wouldn't let them take a camera in, and they didn't have a quorum. And then they marched them out afterwards saying they just voted to hold a referendum on independence. And it was a total sham. And the referendum that was held and publicized showed 97% in Crimea for joining Russia. That's probably what you're referring to, because that election was reported. But the 97% figure is preposterous. In no small measure because you have Crimean Tatars who are Muslims and were native to Crimea, but had been deported under Stalin and came back when Ukraine gained independence. And they are 100% against Russia because of their treatment. They had been herded into cattle cars and moved to different parts of the country, many of them slaughtered. So there was an election, but it was a complete fraud. Having said that, in Crimea, you might have had a 50-50 election or even a marginally pro-Russian election. I was in Crimea about 2.5 years ago, and there is legitimately some pro-Russian sentiment there. There are states where the provinces where the fighting goes on now, these two, maybe 30% have sympathy towards Russia, but it's not much more than that by any credible polling before the fighting began. Yes? Were you stretching, or did you have a question? No. Stretching, okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you talk about historically, it always depends how far back you want to go. It was an independent Muslim Khanate before being conquered by Tsarist Russia. And it was administered by Moscow and the Russian Federation until in '54, Khrushchev administratively gave it to Ukraine. And the reason was clear enough if you look at the map. That's water. There's no bridge, so it's hard to get supplies in, and where you have a land bridge here. So it was easier to come in and supply water and electricity and food by land if it was part of Ukraine as opposed to being administered over here. And one of the reasons Russians are thought to make an offensive here is so they can again have the land bridge as opposed to try to supply over two bridges that have yet to be built. Okay. Now, let's talk about a little bit about Islam. What you see in green is the Islamic world. 1,600,000,000 people. It's enormous. Half of them live in 4 countries only. None of those countries are in the Middle East. Oops. I don't know what I did, but we'll get back to this other map. The 4 countries having 800 million population are Indonesia, which is the biggest Muslim country, India, which is majority Hindu, but still a huge Muslim population, Bangladesh and Pakistan. It's a mistake to talk, first of all, to talk about a Muslim world. There are many Muslim worlds. Life for most Muslims in Indonesia is so different than how they live in India. Even in the Arab world, if you look how the Muslims live in Morocco, it's completely different than in Saudi Arabia. Local cultures have had their impact on religious traditions, and the day-to-day life varies enormously. But for the fanatics that are in all the countries, the vision is remarkably the same. One of the publications of the American Foreign Policy Council is something called the World Almanac on Islamism. It's a definitive reference work of Islamicist movements worldwide, violent and non-violent. There's an online edition you can find at afpc.org. And one of the things I think we don't understand is that people have come to theologically extremist positions through mosques that are in all of these countries worldwide, through the internet. And when you have fighting break out, like you have in Syria today, it's a magnet, and people come from all over the globe. And this is the problem of Muslim extremism is something that is going to be with us throughout the lives of everybody in the room and probably our children and grandchildren. And in many ways, I think it's a much harder problem than that of communism. Communism promised utopia on earth, but when you ended up with 20 million dead in the Soviet Union, 80 million dead in communist China, and no utopia, the sons and daughters, especially the people running the place, understood they were living in a hell and no utopia and everybody being killed. And when that happened, the idea of communism collapsed. When the idea collapsed, the will to kill en masse collapsed. With that, the fear went, and the systems either evolved or changed. But just think, bin Laden goes to Allah. Allah says, eternal damnation, you heretic. What are you doing perverting our great religion? If Allah said that, everybody down on earth still thinks he's being rewarded if you were a bin Laden supporter. So how do you break the idea that leads people to kill innocents with the idea that they're going to be rewarded by Allah in heaven? How do you break that idea? It's an enormously difficult problem, and it's especially difficult for those of us that are in the non-Muslim world, because if it's a theological debate in Islam, what standing do you have as a Christian or a Hindi or a Baha'i or a Buddhist or a Jew? It's very difficult. We're destined to play at the margins in this multi-cornered theological war. Now, what is this theological war about in simple terms? There are huge divisions within Islam. The biggest is between Sunni, which is by far the biggest, and Shia. But within that, those divisions, there's a fight between the modernists and those that want to go back to the Middle Ages. And I'll describe how that plays out within Sunni Islam. The Shias are a little bit different. At the time of early days of Islam, a group called the Mu'tazilites held sway. And they believed, as Christians or Jews would today, that God gave man reason to know God better. So they would read all the ancient texts from the Greeks and the Romans and take from it what they could. They would advance the mathematics and science. They kept learning alive during the Dark Ages. But within a couple centuries, they were replaced by the Ash'arites, whose spiritual descendants now rule the theological centers, most of them within Sunni Islam, not Sufis. And what do they believe? They would say, well, why would you translate any book into Arabic, for instance? Everything you need to know is in the Quran. And by the way, to this day, very few books are translated into Arabic because of this influence of this theology on the culture. They would say, why would you need to have a legislature? all the laws are already in the Quran, which is the hostility movements like Al-Qaeda would have, or ISIS would have to democratic forms of government. And this is the rub. Now, as different as life is for most Muslims, if you're an extremist, you hate other extremists because you have a monopoly on truth and virtue, and you can't stand somebody else that has the same idea that they're the ones with the monopoly. But they're remarkably the same about hostility towards anything that's not like them. And this is the basis for the fighting that's going on in so many places. In Syria now, you have all these forces at work. You have the Iranian government backing Assad because they both have different Shia traditions, but Shia. You have Saudi Arabia backing its factions as the Sunnis. You have different factions within all these camps. And it's the beginning of what may become a general theological war between the Sunni and Shia branch of Islam. The Shia now effectively through Hezbollah are the dominant force in Lebanon. We've talked about what they're doing in Syria. They're the dominant force now in majority Shia Iraq, and they seek to overthrow the Saudi government and the Gulf states by using the Shia minority in those places. Saudi Arabia has talked to Pakistan about getting the nuclear weapon if Iran gets it. So one of the big dangers we have of this turmoil is that you end up with the nuclearization of a very unstable part of the world. You run the danger of weapons being held by people that think the end of the earth might be a good thing because that will permit their particular narrow brand of Islam to triumph. And it's hard to get in the head of people who think death by this fashion is a promotion, but we know they exist because they're killing themselves all the time to advance these goals. Now, some people say, well, Islam, they might have a terror attack here and there, but it's not an existential threat to the U.S., and maybe it's overblowing. I would make two counter-arguments to that point. The first is, we may be worried about Iran getting a bomb, but the government of Pakistan already has an atomic bomb. And the government of Pakistan has its army infiltrated by some of the fanatics that we know exist in the Pakistani state. What we don't know is if any of those infiltrators have made it to units that are protecting atomic bombs that are kept in different parts of Pakistan. One of the nightmares of planners in Washington is what happens if one of those bombs comes under control of Islamicist movement that wants to make a statement by putting it in a boat and sailing it into a western port and blowing up that port through an atomic explosion. At some point, you have to think that you're going to have some weapon of mass destruction that begins to flow into the hands of those people that wish us ill. And if you will blow yourself up to kill 10 people or 1,000 people, why not 100,000? So these movements are a threat to us in that fashion. But it's also another fashion. If you have a series of bombings in shopping malls or sport venues, if you have terrorism that comes to the West that begins to kill not hundreds, but on a regular basis thousands of people, it probably means some sharp curtailment of our civil liberties, which means a real change in our way of life. And that, to my mind, is just as dangerous. Eric Hoffer, the philosopher, once said that if freedom destroys order, society's need for order may destroy freedom. In other words, if the freedom we give people to travel within our midst leads to the death through terrorism on a regular basis of our citizens, we will tighten up the freedom to the point that those people are stopped. China doesn't have the terrorist problem they might have were they not such an authoritarian state, but they don't have the freedoms either. You have, make one quick comment maybe on Iran. Iran has been consistent in what it wants to do in terms of spreading its Shia revolution since the founding of the revolutionary government in Iran in '79. They've zigzagged, but they've never sworn off trying to overthrow other governments in the region and establishing a theological Shia empire, a caliphate, if you would. It seems to me unlikely that they're going to back away from their goal of making the atomic bomb. And to the extent that we've cut a deal with them, they've already started to back away from it. And your internal politics, to my mind, begin to become more extreme, not less extreme, as was hoped when the olive branch was offered by this administration. The supreme leader of Iran is quite sick with cancer and not expected to live much longer. His successor will be picked by a group called the Council of Experts. The Council of Experts has just elected a new head. His name is Yazdi. He's a spiritual mentor to Ahmadinejad, who many of us remember as making the most extreme statements during his tenure as president. He's a man that's a millennialist, which means he thinks that Armageddon is going to come and he has a responsibility to jumpstart it. If he gets his person in as head of Iran, it will take even a sharper turn towards extremism. That has to play out. No one knows how to play out, but it's not a very good early sign in terms of how that society is evolving. And I'll maybe stop and we can take some questions on Islam and ISIS or Libya or anything you want to talk about regarding terror. Yeah. Sunni. Yeah. Well, Osama bin Laden is mostly loved by the Sunnis. Al-Qaeda had a very uneasy relationship with Iran, though they found ways to cooperate, and Iran gave safe haven to some of Osama bin Laden's family. But Osama bin Laden was certainly hid in Pakistan with the knowledge of some elements of the Pakistani security forces, ISI. And it's possible they gave him up as a way of getting the U.S. out of Afghanistan. At least there's some talk to that end. Pakistan, is almost a wholly Muslim country, and if you're a Muslim fanatic there and you don't have non-Muslims to go after, what do? You go after minority Muslim sects, and that's who's persecuted, in addition to the very small minority Christian population. It's a country where a minister can be assassinated because he didn't want a Christian to be executed for saying something negative about Islam. And what happened to the person that assassinated him? It became a folk hero. This is the atmosphere inside of Pakistan. Dangerous. Sunni. No, it's Sunni. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it's the common Sunni bond, and it may lead to the common bomb. Yes. No, these ideologies have been around since the 7th century, and just sometimes they take greater root. One of the reasons we did the Almanac of Islamism is to get away from this idea factually that if the U.S. weren't in Iraq, if Israel weren't there, we wouldn't have a problem with the Islamic world. There are 1,000 people being killed every year in southern Thailand where the U.S. and Israel are complete non-factors. They're pesky Buddhists that want to educate the population in the Buddhist religion. That's enough to be killed. We know what's going on with Boko Haram in Nigeria, where Israel and the U.S. are not. It springs from this narrow interpretation of Islam that seems to have small groups really almost everywhere in the world, and wherever they are, there's a problem. So now what can we do about it? That's another question. The first step is to have a common set of facts. I think we make a mistake by not calling Islamicists by the term they themselves use, Islamicists and jihadists, because if you don't define the problem clearly, you cannot come up with an answer. And I think I can report there's increasing cross-aisle discussions among policy wonks about what to do with this problem, and to the extent that it's understood by Democrats and Republicans how broad the problem is, how it's fed in different ways in different countries. Once that definition is there, then we can begin to develop a common policy. You know, in spite of differences among parties, there was a great amount that was agreed upon in terms of running the Cold War, at least from the 50s on. And that common consensus has to be developed regarding our response to Islamicism worldwide. I think we're in the early stages of that, and it might be another 5-10 years before there's a sustainable bipartisan policy. But I think the process has begun. Serious discussions have begun on a quiet level. And so I'm feeling much better than I was 5 years about a U.S. response. Yeah. The two-state solution, I think, in the short term is illusionary. It may be the best option, but I still think it's illusionary. And it's illusionary for this reason, because there are people in both Israel and Arab countries that will never permit it to happen. And there's so much mistrust, there's so many raw nerves that a terror attack here, an assassination there, is probably enough to put everything off course. And, you know, if you sat in Israel and you read the internal text about the groups you're negotiating with never going to permit the existence of a Jewish state, that's not an encouragement to sign up. And, you know, you can argue it both ways, but I think it's very difficult. I think the state of Israel is in trouble because, as I said before, if you blow yourself up to kill 200 people, why not 100,000? And if a weapon of mass destruction gets in the hands of people that are willing to blow themselves up, can the Jewish state survive? Can they survive a massive rocket attack from Iran? Small one, yes, but 10,000 rockets come in. Is that sustainable? I think it's a very tough time ahead for Israel. Yeah. There certainly have been rumors about gun sales through Benghazi, by the way, through anti-Assad forces, and could some U.S. weapons have ended up with ISIS the way weapons transfers have been made? It's possible, but I have not seen proof I would take to a court of law. But is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Egypt, then I'll come back to you. One of the encouraging signs of the new military head of Egypt went to their great Islamic center of learning, their great theological center. It's the most important in Sunni Islam. And he said, we're slaughtering each other in the name of religion, and you have to find a theological construct to make that unacceptable. Then I found the most underreported and most encouraging speech by a major Muslim figure in a long time, and it's too early to see how that will play out. But I view it as constructive, and we'll see how effective it is. Yes. Yes. Yeah. The question, I don't know if everybody heard it, but the question is, U.S. lobbied heavily for our allies in Western Europe not to join China in founding this new bank that will be a rival to the World Bank. First, it shows that we've lost the confidence of our allies in Europe, because had the U.S. decided 30 years ago to oppose something, there wouldn't be a European state that would have gone another way. So it shows our declining clout in Europe, and correspondingly it shows the corresponding growth of economic clout that comes from China, because Western European economies are tied to China, who will use economic leverage to gain political ends, while we tend to do that less and think more in terms of economic terms. I suspect you're going to see the growth of Chinese economic influence worldwide to continue. Okay. How are we on time? Well, okay. Oh. Well, let me do it this way first. Any part of the world anybody wants to discuss, I'll take a question. And we'll see where that goes, and if we hit a dead end, I'll make a couple concluding comments. Yeah. Speak just a little louder for me, please. Yes. Is it official that the Russian soldiers in Ukraine? Putin has admitted the soldiers in Crimea, which of course is officially Russian now because they've annexed it, but the pretense has been pretty well given up. There are at least 8,000 regular Russian forces in the two eastern provinces of Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And they have been giving interviews to Western media, so you can find interviews with them if you dig hard enough on Reuters, for instance. It's an open secret. I think comments from the NATO Secretary General to that effect have been made. So it's Putin has never admitted it in terms of Luhansk and Donetsk, the two eastern provinces. Pretty well everybody knows that it's a fact, and you're going to have to speak a little louder for me. Well, it depends what media you read. Let me explain the confusion, and this is probably a good general point. Russians have a term called disinformatia. It means disinformation, literally. It's one of the cognates between English and Russian. And this is essentially a sophisticated form of propaganda. They think that they can affect Western decision-making by planting bad facts and continually tell the same lie over and over and over and over. Putin on Russian TV, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, was caught saying, you know, the Nazis might have lost World War II, but Goebbels, who was Hitler's propaganda chief, never lost the information war. So when you hear these statements, there are no Russian soldiers there, they're sometimes picked up by legitimate media and people that believe it. And once it's in one story, it gets to another story, to another story. But it's gradually getting debunked, and I don't think in a private conversation and in general in a public conversation, any major Russian leader is denying that there are Russian soldiers in the eastern part of Ukraine now. I can find you quotes if you want to get them. I'll be happy to send them. Yeah. Well, you know, if you have Russian soldiers that have been captured and they give interviews, I think we should assume that they're Russian soldiers. Any other questions? Any part of the world? Yeah.
I never would have guessed 20 years later, 30 years later, that China would be where it is today. So China's going from a rather totalitarian state that has a backward economy in advance of what's like mixed economy. And a lot of people, a lot of politicians, a lot of economists are saying China's at a tipping point. They have to either choose capitalist system or revert back to some kind of a socialist system. But to move forward, China is going to have to choose a path that's either more of a free market or become more of a European socialist state. And yet, we worry that in the place of peace, they've moved much more towards the market in the last 10 years because their market socialist system didn't work. Where do you see China in a geopolitical economic system 10 years, 50 years from now?
Well, I think it certainly will go more towards the free market because the sons and daughters of everybody that's important in business in China or the party have spent enough time in the West to not be fans of the big state-run enterprises that still have disproportionate influence within the Chinese economy. But how you get there is not necessarily an easy path. China's economic growth has been staggering. I've been there at least once a year since '94. And to see what they've done with that society economically is just breathtaking. But they have a big problem with corruption that they're trying to deal with now in little steps. They have other problems with the military being put fully under control. And it's not 100%. I think they're going to make it, but it's not 100% that they won't have severe political upheaval at some point. So society going through change that rapidly is a bit unstable. It's maybe the stability of the bicycle. As long as economic growth keeps going big, they're fine. But if it ever slows, I think they're in for huge problems. Two quick notes on the economy, maybe things that are not widely known. At the last party congress, the reforms have been made to the Chinese judicial system. The idea is to get government and party influence somewhat out of the court system. The way it works now in China, the courts aren't independent. You know, if you and I have a business dispute and we go to a court, you know, it could be a bribe, it could be somebody interferes. You have more political clout than I do, so you get it because the party boss comes and talks to the judge, and that's how the decision is made. So what's being done now? Now the people running China want the party to be supreme. They have to have the final say on everything. But they don't want party interference if it's to line somebody's pockets. So now, if you're a party official, you can intervene in a court case, and if you intervene to further the interests of the party, you might even get promoted. Same with a government official who has to be a party member. But if you intervene, it becomes part of the official record. And then the party disciplinary committee comes along to review court cases. And if they find you intervened to line your pocket, you're in big trouble. If you did it to further the country, it's okay. But the thought is, when they put that proviso in, and it has to be part of the record, the amount of interference will go down dramatically because nobody will want to take a chance with their future. So little things like that are being done on the edges to move it. It's almost Burkean in the sense that you build gradually on the culture. Yes? Sure, anywhere. Yes. Well, Obama has the idea that if we open up to Cuba, we can help the system evolve. The general argument is we've had an embargo on Cuba since the 50s, and the system hasn't evolved, so let's try something different. The Cubans can get pretty much what they want from free trade zones and so forth. So that's the argument for going in. Now, what is clear is that the Castros are old. Fidel is seen in public about once a year and is not in good health. His brother running the show is in his mid-80s. And if you talk to people that have spent time in Cuba, the young communists, the sons and daughters of the elite, they live in compounds, they have their satellite dishes, they have their color TVs, they're living fat already, and they're planning to be the first capitalists in the same way that the communists in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were planning to be the first really rich people. So instead of the communist elite, they're going to be the capitalist elite. That's coming. I would have liked it if the opening up that's coming would have gone with some concessions on human rights and on prisoners beyond what we had. But change is coming to Cuba, and at some point we have to come to the table. So we have an open mind on how that's going to play out. Yes? Well, let me put China up there now. Here's where China stands with its borders. This part of Russia was China once, and at some point they're going to want it back. But here's how this worked. In the 17th century, these were aboriginal territories, what's now eastern Siberia and the Russian Far East. And trappers from China and Russia went up there and they bumped into each other and they fought. Finally, the Chinese wiped out the big American fort at Albajan, killing almost everybody. And Russia sued for peace. It was the first treaty China made with a foreign country, and Treaty of Nerchinsk, 1689. So from 1689 to the mid-1800s, this was China. But in the mid-1800s, China was weak because of the Second Opium War. That's a whole other story. And Russia made two land grabs in 1858 and 1860, and they just went in and took it. And the Chinese over there were pushed into the freezing river and died. So it was a kind of a brutal takeover, but China was too weak to do anything about it. At some point, that's likely to come into play again. China is also claiming this area of India, and there are disputes up here also with India. The hot spot has been the islands where there's disputes with a number of countries, and I think I have a map on that here. I'll show you. This impossible maze of lines shows conflicting claims by 6 people, the 6 countries: Japan, Korea, Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam. They all have conflicting island chain claims with China. China is preempting, and they're just using their force to build habitable structures on these islands, which are mostly slightly underwater. And they're the big guy on the block, and nobody's getting in their way, and they're being pretty aggressive that way. They've taken a reef from the Philippines, and you see how far the Philippines is away from China, but Scarborough Shoals there, is now under effective control of China. That is around here. But China does not have much of a Muslim problem. In the eastern, far western part of China is Xinjiang. There are 8 million Uyghurs. But to the south you have fundamentally Hindus and Buddhists. To the north you have Orthodox Christians in Russia. You have Buddhists in Mongolia. It's only on their western part do they have borders with Muslims. And it's a problem, but not a big problem. Yes? Yeah. I spent a couple years ago time in Fujian. Fujian is the Chinese province opposite Taiwan, and it's where they have their big institute. The PRC has its big institute studying Taiwan. This is a line that came from that institute. I said, you don't really think that Taiwan would vote to join China, do you? He said, no, they would not vote to join China. And I said, well, is it because of religious freedom, democracy? Is it because of economics? Why do you think they would not vote? He says all those reasons and more, but we think it will change as the generations change. And those that have the closest ties to Japan die, those that are formed by the Civil War die. We think the younger people will see their interests as Chinese evolve as much in Taiwan, or as much with the PRC as with independence. And they would note that some of the richest people in Taiwan have the majority of their wealth now on the mainland. Going the other way, and some of my first trips to China, I remember being in Shanghai and talking about the enormous influence Taiwanese businessmen had on the initial opening up of the Chinese economy, because they could go in there and talk about another system, and I think had some influence. I don't know what's going to happen to Taiwan in the short term. Long term, you can make the case that there will be some unification, but what are you talking about in terms of long term? Are we talking 100 years? Are we talking 50 years? Are we talking 10 years? I have no idea. I do know that it's not something that's going to happen, likely to happen by force. People say the PRC could sink our aircraft carriers. Well, maybe, but they can't control the Straits of Malacca where all the oil comes from. So I don't think it'll be pushed, especially since you have the very sharp increase in tourism back and forth, and trade back and forth, and communications back and forth, air flights back and forth. I think that the view probably in the short term from Beijing is that things are in general going on the right way, and let's leave the final solution to another generation. That would be my take. Any other questions? I think we've hit the end of our allotted time, and thank you all so much.